Welcome to the channel. Hit subscribe and dive into stories that'll stay with you long after the video ends. Let's begin. The fluorescent lights flickered as Marcy pushed the mop across the cold linoleum floor. Each stroke echoed in the empty classroom, a hollow rhythm against the rows of abandoned desks. The scent of chalk dust clung to the air, mingling with the faint tang of bleach from the bucket at her side. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, whispering secrets she couldn't quite catch. She paused, letting the mop drip, and glanced at the clock. 10:30, late for anyone but her. Her coat was pulled tight against the draft creeping under the door, and her hands, rough and red from scrubbing, tightened around the handle. Marcy had worked nights here for 5 years. The students left footprints in the carpet in the morning. She erased them by evening. But tonight felt different. A sudden thud from the hallway made her heart leap. She froze. The echo lingered like a warning. "Hello?" She called softly, her voice swallowed by the emptiness. No answer. Only the hum of the overhead lights, the distant creak of the old heating pipes, and the low moan of the wind outside. She shook her head. Just the building settling. Her own words sounded thin. Her hands went back to the mop, but she couldn't ignore the sensation of eyes watching. She turned, scanning the shadows beneath the desks. The classrooms were small, lined with posters of multiplication tables and motivational slogans. The walls, scuffed and chipped, had stories in every mark. Marcy sighed. Every night was the same. She scrubbed, polished, arranged, empty chairs staring back at her like quiet observers. Sometimes she imagined them whispering thanks, other times complaints, stories from the lives that filled them each day. "Hey, Ms. Marcy," a voice suddenly whispered from the corner. She spun, heart hammering. Nothing, just her imagination. Or maybe the building itself. The mop paused mid-sweep. She leaned against the bucket, letting the silence wash over her. The cold seemed to seep into her bones, making her shiver. Cleaning was more than a job. It was a ritual, a way to carve order into chaos. But tonight the ritual felt hollow. As she stacked chairs on the tables, she noticed something she hadn't before. A small paper on the teacher's desk. White, folded neatly. No handwriting she recognized. Curiosity pricked at her, sharp and urgent. Marcy picked it up. Her fingers trembled, partly from the cold, partly from the anticipation. The note smelled faintly of pencil and wax crayon, the way old papers sometimes did. She unfolded it carefully. "Thank you," it said in a childlike scrawl. Just those 2 words, her chest tightened. She looked around the empty room. The sound of the mop bucket settling in the corner suddenly seemed deafening. Her mind raced. Which student had stayed behind to leave this? Why now, after all these years of nights spent alone? Marcy sat down at the teacher's desk, note in hand. The words were simple, but they carried weight, a warmth she hadn't realized she was missing. She stared at them for a long moment, letting the quiet pulse through her, her heart slowing in the dim light. Outside, the wind rose again, rattling the windows, and somewhere deep in the hallway, she thought she heard the faint scrape of shoes. Too light for an adult, too deliberate to be a trick of the building. Marcy folded the note and put it in her pocket. She told herself it was nothing, just a forgotten paper from the day. And yet she couldn't shake the feeling that tonight, something was shifting. Something that had been buried under years of routine, under endless nights of silent work, was finally stirring. She glanced at the darkened hallway, then back at the note. The fluorescent lights flickered once more, and the shadows seemed to lean in closer, almost as if they were listening. And then she heard it, a faint whisper again. This time unmistakable. Marcy's breath caught in her throat. She rose slowly, gripping the mop like a lifeline. The whisper had come again, soft, urgent, almost melodic, as if the walls themselves were speaking. She told herself it was the wind, the old pipes, the building settling into its usual nighttime sigh. But deep down, she knew better. Her eyes scanned the hallway. Shadows stretched long and jagged beneath the flickering fluorescent lights. The lockers, once bright blue, now looked bruised in the dimness. She stepped forward, each footfall muffled by the worn carpet runner, each heartbeat pounding like a drum in her ears. "Hello?" Her voice trembled slightly. Not from fear, she told herself, but from anticipation. Something was there. Someone. She reached the classroom door across the hall, the one that always smelled faintly of glue and old paper. She paused. The handle was cool under her fingers, the metal slick with condensation. She hesitated, then turned the knob. The door opened with a soft groan, revealing a classroom bathed in dim moonlight streaming through the tall windows. The desks were empty, the chairs stacked. Nothing seemed out of place, and yet, the feeling of being watched pressed against her skin like a second coat. She took a cautious step inside. The air smelled faintly of erasers and ink, and the faint scent of lavender lingered, as if someone had passed through recently. Her eyes fell on the teacher's desk. Another note, small, folded and placed carefully in the center. Hands shaking, she picked it up. "You see me." No signature. No hint of who had left it. Just those 3 words, so simple and yet so precise that they made her chest tighten. Marcy's mind raced. Who? Why? And why now? After all these years of silent nights and endless cleaning, a sudden scrape behind her made her spin. The window curtains moved gently, though no wind blew inside. Shadows shifted unnaturally, almost as if someone crouched in the corner watching her every move. Marcy swallowed hard. Her mop slipped from her hands and hit the floor with a clatter. The sound reverberated off the walls like a gunshot. She froze, listening. Only silence answered. She bent down to pick up the mop, telling herself to stay calm. She had cleaned these halls for years. She knew every creak, every whisper of the old pipes, every echo of the empty classrooms. And yet tonight the familiar had turned strange. Even the ticking of the clock sounded louder, sharper, like it was counting down something she didn't understand. The note in her pocket burned against her side. She pulled it out and smoothed it against her palm. The paper was fragile, soft with handling. The words from the first note, "Thank you," and the second, "You see me," blended in her mind, forming a puzzle she couldn't solve. Marcy's gaze drifted to the far wall, where a faded poster of a smiling teacher hung crookedly. For the first time, she felt seen, not as the janitor who cleaned after everyone else, not as the background figure moving silently through hallways, but truly seen. A small sound, soft, deliberate, echoed from the next classroom. Her heart skipped. She didn't want to call out. She didn't want to confirm that someone was there. But curiosity, sharper than fear, drew her forward. Step by step, Marcy moved down the hall, each footfall measured, each breath shallow. The lights flickered again, and she caught the faintest glimpse of movement at the corner of her eye. Quick, fleeting, like a shadow slipping into darkness. And then, as she reached the doorway, she froze. On the floor near the teacher's chair was a tiny envelope, her name written neatly on it. The envelope was closed, but she could feel its weight. Promise, fear, something urgent waiting inside. She bent down slowly, fingers trembling, and picked it up. The whisper came again, this time clear, almost a breath against her ear. "Don't ignore me." Marcy held the envelope in her hands, its weight heavier than paper should ever feel. Her fingers lingered on the edges, tracing the neat handwriting, the kind that made her think of careful, deliberate work. She could hear her own heartbeat loud in her chest, a drumbeat that seemed to echo off the walls. She hesitated. The hallway was empty, or at least it appeared so. Shadows moved with the flickering lights, long and distorted, but she told herself that was just the building's trick, the way old spaces seemed to breathe when no one was around. Who's there?" she whispered. Her voice barely reached past her lips, swallowed immediately by the emptiness. Silence answered, but it felt alive, like the building itself held its breath. Finally, with a trembling hand, she tore open the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once, corners creased from careful handling. Her eyes scanned the words, "I've been watching. You clean for us every night. We never see you, but I do. You matter." The note was unsigned, but the handwriting was unmistakably young, nervous, yet precise. Marcy felt a warmth in her chest she hadn't felt in years, a light creeping through the exhaustion and loneliness that had become her nightly companions. She sat on the edge of the nearest desk, the paper trembling slightly in her hands. She whispered to herself, almost disbelieving, "Someone notices." The wind rattled the windows behind her, and the fluorescent lights flickered violently, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. The mop bucket sat in the corner like a sentinel, water sloshing quietly with every vibration from the old pipes. Marcy felt herself drawn forward, compelled to follow some invisible thread of curiosity. Step by step, she moved to the next classroom. Every creak of the floorboard beneath her feet sounded like a shout in the silence. She held the note close as if it were armor, protection against the building's weighty stillness. She pushed open the door. The room was dark, except for a sliver of moonlight cutting across the floor. And there, sitting on a desk near the window, was a small figure, barely visible, almost a shadow. A child clutching a notebook to their chest, eyes wide in fear and determination. Marcy froze. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you," she said softly. Her voice trembled, more from wonder than fear. The child shifted, hands trembling as they extended a tiny paper toward her. Marcy took it gently. Another note. This one read, "I wanted to say thank you in person, but I was too scared. Please know that someone cares." Her chest tightened and a lump rose in her throat. She felt tears sting her eyes, not for herself, not for the long nights spent in silence, but for the recognition, the validation of something she had done quietly for years. The child's eyes met hers. There was a raw honesty there, a mixture of courage and vulnerability. "I just wanted to let you know," the child said softly, voice barely above a whisper. Marcy knelt down to meet them at eye level. You did," she said, her own voice breaking. "You just did." A silence followed, deep and full, stretching between them. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows as if urging the world to notice this quiet connection. And then, without warning, the child darted back into the shadows of the hallway, leaving Marcy alone with the notes and the echo of tiny footsteps. Her heart raced. Her mind spun. Something had shifted tonight. Something had finally broken through the years of invisibility. Marcy clutched the notes to her chest, listening. The hallway was empty. The lights flickered. And yet she knew. She had been seen. And that knowledge felt like the first breath after being underwater for a long time. The hallway seemed different now, alive with the echo of the child's footsteps. Marcy stayed still for a long moment, listening to the faint creak of the floorboards settling, the low hum of the fluorescent lights. The notes pressed against her chest, warm from her hands, as though they carried some quiet pulse of life. She moved forward, each step deliberate. The building felt both familiar and strange, a labyrinth of shadows and memory. Every classroom she passed was a relic of laughter and learning, walls painted with the echoes of voices she would never hear again. Her mop bucket, abandoned in the corner, reflected the flickering lights like a tiny pool of stars in a darkened sky. She stopped outside her favorite classroom, the one she had always imagined as the center of everything she did. The door was slightly ajar, and a thin beam of moonlight spilled across the floor. She could see faint footprints, small and hurried, that led to the back corner where the desk was. Marcy's fingers traced the edges of the notes again. She felt a swell of emotion, a strange combination of awe and apprehension. The child had reached out to her in a way no one else ever had, breaking the isolation she had carried like a heavy cloak for years. The whisper of movement came again, soft and deliberate. She froze. The shadows seemed to bend toward her, elongating and curling as though they had a life of their own. You don't have to be scared," she said aloud, though she wasn't sure if anyone was listening. Her voice cracked in the emptiness. From the darkness, a small figure emerged. Not the child this time, but a shadow that shifted unnaturally. Her heart skipped a beat, panic rising. And yet, there was a sense of inevitability in the air, as if something that had been waiting for years had finally chosen this moment. Marcy stepped closer, her hands trembling slightly. "Show yourself," she whispered. The words felt strange on her lips, commanding and pleading at the same time. A soft rustle answered her, followed by a delicate voice, barely audible. "It's me, the one who wrote the notes." The child stepped into the moonlight. Their eyes, wide and earnest, met hers with an intensity that made Marcy's chest ache. There was no fear now, only a quiet bravery that radiated from every movement, every gesture. I wanted to tell you," the child said, fumbling with the notebook in their hands. "I see how hard you work. You're always here, always making things better for everyone else. And I wanted you to know you matter." Marcy knelt, lowering herself to meet them at eye level. Her voice trembled, thick with emotion. I didn't think anyone noticed, she admitted. The words tasted foreign, heavy with years of silence and overlooked effort. The child shook their head, a small smile breaking across their face. I notice. I notice everything. The wind rattled the windows as if echoing the significance of this revelation. Marcy's gaze drifted to the mop, to the gleaming desks, to the tiny notes that had led her here. Everything seemed more vivid, sharper, infused with meaning she had almost forgotten existed. She reached out, brushing a strand of hair from the child's face. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. I think I needed to hear that more than I realized." The child nodded, the corners of their eyes crinkling with a quiet pride. They turned, slipping back into the shadows, leaving Marcy in the stillness, alone but profoundly changed. Marcy exhaled slowly, letting the silence envelop her. The hallway seemed softer now, less foreboding, as if it had shifted with the truth that had been spoken, the recognition that had finally been given. And somewhere deep inside, she felt a fragile, glowing ember of hope that hadn't existed before tonight, a promise that she was seen, and that the quiet labor of her life could touch another soul. Marcy sank into the teacher's chair, the notes still clutched in her hands. The hallway outside was quiet again. The wind softened to a whisper. The fluorescent light steady for the first time all night. Her chest rose and fell with slow, deliberate breaths, each one letting a little more of the tension drain away. She looked around the classroom, really looked, in a way she hadn't in years. The mop leaned against the wall, still wet from her labor. Dust motes floated lazily in the moonlight, tiny sparks suspended in the air like scattered stars. The desks, the scuffed floors, the faded posters, all of it carried a strange new significance. They were markers of care, evidence that someone had been here, shaping this space quietly, endlessly. Her mind wandered to the child, small and brave, who had dared to reach across the silence and leave a trace of recognition. Marcy felt a lump form in her throat. In the years she had worked here, nights had been long and lonely, each room a small world of solitude and shadows. And yet, for the first time, she understood something essential. Her labor had not been invisible. It had mattered. The first note, simple, childlike, almost hesitant, spoke of thanks. The second, delicate, urgent, spoke of being seen. And tonight, the meeting in the moonlit classroom had crystallized the truth. Even in the shadows, even when unnoticed, her actions had meaning. The weight she had carried, the quiet exhaustion of endless floors and empty chairs, had touched someone's life profoundly. Marcy rose slowly, placing the notes carefully on the teacher's desk. She ran her fingers along the smooth surface, feeling the grooves, the scratches, the stories embedded in the wood. She breathed in deeply, tasting the familiar sense of chalk, ink, and the faint tang of cleaning supplies. Everything seemed sharper, warmer, alive with possibility. She walked down the hallway, each step lighter than the last. The school, once oppressive and cavernous at night, now felt like a companion, a quiet witness to the small but significant moments that had unfolded. Marcy reached the main office and paused, glancing back at the long corridor of classrooms. Shadows lingered, but they no longer pressed against her. They seemed to nod, to acknowledge the quiet miracle of connection she had just experienced. The wind rustled the windows one last time, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves from outside. Marcy smiled softly, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. She had spent years in the background, wiping away crumbs, erasing footprints, mopping floors no one noticed. And tonight, a single voice had pierced the silence, a simple, brave act that reminded her she was seen, she was valued, and she had made a difference. She stepped outside, the cool night air embracing her. The stars above glimmered faintly, distant and steady. She held the notes to her chest for one last heartbeat, and then let them go, leaving them on the desk like a small offering to memory and gratitude. Marcy inhaled again, filling her lungs with the crisp night air. She felt lighter, as if something invisible had been lifted from her shoulders. She had been seen, she had mattered, and the quiet courage of one child had changed the way she would carry herself through the nights ahead. For the first time in years, she smiled fully, freely. The school stood silent behind her, Ordinary in its bricks and windows, yet extraordinary in the life it had witnessed that night. Somewhere a small voice, a flicker of hope, had reminded her that even in darkness, connection was possible. Marcy turned away from the doors, the notes lingering like echoes in her mind, and stepped forward into the quiet promise of morning. She had cleaned classrooms at night for years, unseen and unheralded, and now she knew. She was never truly invisible. Thanks for watching.